Hey there, music lovers. Welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for dropping by. In this video, I want to talk about the re-release of the Beatles' White Album. Just came out again, a reissue with the works. You know, we're talking about remixes, extra bonus tracks, and all this stuff. Just in time for Christmas, you know, or maybe they're just putting it out because the album originally came out in November 1968. I don't know. But the album, when it first came out, it went to #1 on the US charts. It stayed up there for a number of weeks. I think it was like 9 weeks or something. And it has once again gone into the top 10. I think it's at #6 now on Billboard, which really speaks to the popularity of this album. An album, by the way, that never had any singles released, if you can believe that. But yet, there's plenty of songs from this album that a lot of people know and love and that are staples in the Beatles catalog. This album came on the heels of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you know, and that was an album that blew a lot of people's minds. And that album basically was one big LSD trip. I mean, that album was really written with a lot of acid being dropped. The White Album was more of a weed album. It's more of a pot album than Sgt. Pepper's. The band actually went to India before they started to record this album, and that's where a lot of these songs were actually written. The band went to India. They hooked up with some kind of a meditation course by the Maharishi Yogi, or as I like to call him, Yogi Bear. And they were out over there for a few months, and that's where they started to write a lot of these songs. Lennon and McCartney would kind of meet in their hotels, and they would write songs when they really shouldn't have been. They should have been meditating. But they came back from that trip, and they did some demos called the Usher Demos, and those are all here. There's like 27 early acoustic type demos, and then there's also the session outtakes, you know, multiple takes of songs from this album. There's some pieces that didn't even make the album. There's like 50 of those. A lot of this stuff is unreleased. I'm not going to get into all of that stuff. This video would be a couple of hours long. I mean, there's so much history. There's so much wrapped around this album that, you know, I'm trying to make my videos shorter. So, you know, digging into the White Album is just like the worst thing I could be doing now. But what I really wanted to do, because I don't actually own the reissue, I do have the audio from the remix of the album. I've heard that, and I think that, you know, that was really, really good. Actually, they remixed this entire album. Giles Martin, who is the son of George Martin, the famous Beatles producer who passed away recently, he went in and he remixed this whole album. There's even a 5.1 version of it here. I haven't heard that. But the remixes are really, really good. You know, I really don't have a problem with a remix as long as it stays faithful. Because you have to keep in mind, a lot of this stuff was recorded, you know, 40, 50 years ago when the technology was very, very different. If they can do something to kind of bring it alive and to kind of fix some things that might have been wrong, I'm okay with that. As long as the original version is still available and you can still go back to it and listen to it, I don't mind having an alternate version, which is a remix. And from what I have heard, even with the Sgt. Pepper album, the remixes have been very, very strong. I've really enjoyed them. Very, very clean. And if you're a fan of Ringo's Starr, this one's for you, because Ringo really shines on this album. They really bring his drums out. With this album, I kind of thought, you know, this could be whittled down. That was my first thought, because I've always been a fan of the White Album. There's a bunch of songs on this album that I don't really care for. I think there's a lot of filler on this album. And I think that out of the 30 or so songs that are on this album, I think you could cut it down to about 15, 16 songs. And when I started thinking about the whole Beatles Whittle album concept, I read this article, and I swear this is a coincidence. I read this article where George Martin was talking about the same thing. Like, he thought there was a lot of filler, and he said it could be whittled down. And when I read that, I just had to laugh, because it was the exact same thing that I was thinking without even realizing it, that there's just a bit much here. There's just a lot of stuff going on here. Before this, the Beatles were great at mixing a lot of different styles into one song, you know, but on this album, each song is its own style. You know, this album covers hard rock, blues, folk, country. I mean, there's ska, there's all kinds of different styles going on here. This album was, you know, a kind of a turning point for the Beatles. They were kind of going through some real growing pains here. I think it was Ringo or somebody mentioned that you could hear the Beatles breaking up on this album. This is when their cracks really started to appear. You had a lot of different things going on. I think they were all kind of getting tired of one another. You had Yoko Ono now suddenly showing up at the sessions, you know, and she would be off with John in the recording studio, and they're doing like Revolution #9. And Paul McCartney wasn't a part of that. So there was some friction going on. The band were recording for the most part in different studios. Not so much because they hated each other, but just because they had so many songs, they had so much work that they had to do in such a short period of time. But you had George Martin wasn't crazy about this album. He even took like a leave of absence. The engineer, Jeff Emmerich, he just quit during the recording sessions. Ringo Starr even quit the band for a little bit of time. So there was a lot of shit going on. I mean, I've heard some reports that it was generally a happy time, that there was a lot of fun going on, but there was also some shit going on. So it was kind of a mixed bag. Basically, when they got back from India, they did the demos and then they hit the studio. And so what I want to do is I want to just run through the songs that I would keep on this album and then the songs that I would ditch from this album. And I've got a playlist. I took all the songs, and actually all of these new remixes are up on YouTube. So I put them into a playlist of what my Beatles Whittled album would be. So I want you to let me know, you know, what is your Whittled album? I want you to put it down below, okay? But these are the songs that I would save from this album, okay? Back in the USSR, of course, the track that starts off the album, that was a song that was like a parody of this Chuck Berry song called Back in the USA. It even has some Beach Boys harmonies going on, and that was actually recommended by Mike Love of the Beach Boys, who was on this trip to India with them. He was like, you know, you should put some Beach Boys harmonies in there too. And so I always did love that song, and it sounds really good. The remix sounds really, really good. After that, I would keep Dear Prudence. I think that's a really cool song. That's a classic Lennon song. That was written about Mia Farrow's daughter, Prudence. Of course, Mia Farrow is an actress, and her daughter Prudence was on the trip to India. See, there's a lot of India ties. A lot of these songs, like I said, they were written in India. Some of the songs were written about how they felt while they were there, experiences that they had. And this song, Prudence, was written about Prudence Farrow and how she didn't come out of her room a whole lot. So it was kind of about that. After that, Glass Onion, always did love that song. That was kind of a way that they were kind of mocking the fans for coming up with some of this stupid shit like, you know, Paul is dead, and, you know, you'll hear him talk about the walrus, and, you know, the walrus was Paul, and that kind of stuff. So they're kind of using this song to address some of the things that fans, some of these fantastical things that fans had come up with. After that is Obla Di, Obla Da, and that's a song that John Lennon infamously called Granny, what do you call it? Granny music shit. He had a problem with Paul McCartney's songwriting. Like, it got to a point where they stopped complimenting each other. You know, they didn't really build each other up a whole lot. And John Lennon just had a problem with the whole, you know, Spoon in June kind of way that Paul McCartney wrote. And he didn't like the style, this particular style that Paul McCartney had. So wasn't a big fan of this particular song. But after that, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, of course, the George Harrison classic that actually has the guitar great Eric Clapton playing on it. That's a really cool song. Always did love that one. And then there's Happiness is a Warm Gun, which has always been one of my favorite songs from this album. It might even be my favorite. I'm not sure, but it's close. This is one of the few songs on the album that the whole band actually plays on. That might sound crazy, but there's a number of songs on this album where it might only be one Beatle or maybe a couple, but this was an album that was very, you know, it's like I said, it was an all over the place kind of album. People kind of working, you know, on their own here and there, not everybody playing all the time on any given track. And this was one where they all came together and they really rose to the occasion to make this song great, because this is a song that probably has more going on in it than anything else. Lots of different parts. Kind of reminds me of like the Abbey Road medley, kind of all squeezed into one song here. Then we get Martha My Dear, which is just classic Paul McCartney. It was named after a dog that he had. This is an example of a song where Paul McCartney was the only Beatle playing on it. Everybody else was like a hired hand, particularly to get the orchestral stuff going on. All right, then we get to a song called Don't Pass Me By, which is actually the first Ringo Starr composition to be featured on a Beatles album. Now, even though Ringo sang on some Beatles stuff, before this was the first time he ever wrote the song. The other ones were written for him to sing. I always thought this was just kind of a fun song. I've seen Ringo live a couple of times, and he'll pull this on out, and it's just, you know, the crowd sings along. It's kind of a fun song. It's not great, but it's better than Octopus's Garden, that's for sure. Then there's I Will. Always thought that was a nice little acoustic piece that McCartney had. It's got John Lennon and Ringo Starr playing some percussion there in the background. And then there's Julia, which is actually the last song that was recorded for this album. And it's the only Beatles song to feature only John Lennon. The song was a tribute to his mother, Julia, who was killed in a car accident in 1958. Then after that, we get Birthday. Of course, that's a classic song right there. That was one that Paul McCartney sang in the style of Little Richard, because they were inspired by this rock and roll movie that had come out at that time. And that was a pure Lennon McCartney. That was them firing on all cylinders there. Then there's Yer Blues, which I always thought that was a great, great Lennon song. That's one of my favorites on this album. It's just a really good blues, like a harder blues kind of song. Definitely was inspired by the British blues scene that was kind of going on at that time between, you know, Cream and Fleetwood Mac and Jimi Hendrix and everything. That was the Beatles kind of dipping their toe into that genre. And then we get Helter Skelter, which of course is a classic. You know, love that song. That was the one that Charles Manson kind of took, you know, into his own and used it. You know, it was kind of like an inspirational song for him to do whatever it was that he was doing. That was a real heavy song. You know, this was another example of the Beatles kind of going into a heavier type of territory, you know, because this was, you know, you had like Jimi Hendrix going on. And I believe by this time you had like Blue Cheer might have already been around. And so you did have some of the harder edged blues stuff going on and some of the harder rock. The Kinks were out too by this point. And so the Beatles were kind of tapping into the harder rock that was kind of emerging. They were tapping into the blues. They were tapping into the folk and the country and just everything. They just had their pulse on everything going on. After that, we get Cry Baby Cry, which is a really cool John Lennon song. And then I would close the album out with Good Night, which is another Ringo Starr song. It was a song that was written by John Lennon about his son Julian, but he wanted Ringo to sing it. And, you know, you could easily say, oh, this song is crap. Why would you keep that? The only real reason why I would keep it is because it's just a good way to end the album. It's called Good Night, you know, so it kind of sounds like a good way to end the album. So those are my songs that I would pick for my Beatles Whittled album. What are yours? Now these are the songs that I would cut out. I would cut out Wild Honey Pie, the continuing story of Bungalow Bill. I never did like that song. That's the one that's got Yoko Ono on it. I mean, anytime you got anything with Yoko, count me out, definitely. Then there's I'm So Tired, which is, that's just kind of a blasé song from John Lennon. That was actually written by him while he was in India. And maybe he smoked a lot of weed that day, and he was just very, very tired. It was inspired by that trip. Then there's Piggies, which is like a political, social commentary by George Harrison. I just didn't really care for that song a whole lot. Then there's Rocky Raccoon, which even George Martin didn't really care for this song. And, there was talk like if this album wasn't a double album and they weren't afforded all that space, this song would have never made it. I really don't care for that song. Why Don't We Do It in the Road? That's a song that Paul McCartney wrote. He was inspired by these two monkeys who were doing it out in the middle of the road when they were in India. And so, it's kind of it's a fun song, but it's just not a necessary song. Mother Nature's Son, I was never really crazy about that. Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey. I don't know what the deal is with the monkeys, but that's another one that I just don't think is necessary. Sexy Sadie, Long, 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 a George Harrison tune. And then, of course, there's Revolution #1 and #9. Revolution #9 is the one I remember when I was a kid. That song used to just freak me out because there's just some really weird shit going on in that song. And that's one that John Lennon and Yoko Ono worked on. Like, that was their baby. And it's probably just one of the worst. I mean, it's not even a song. There's no kind of music on it. It's just a bunch of sound effects and a lot of weird shit going on in that one. My favorite version of Revolution is the one that's not on this album. It's the one that rocks out. I think it was a B-side, the heavy version. That's what I prefer. So anyway, those are the songs that I would cut. Let me know what you think. What do you think about the Beatles' White Album? What do you think about the reissue? Have you heard the remixes? What do you think of them? What is the track list for your Beatles Whittled album? I want you to put it down below. Be sure to check out my playlist that includes my version of the White Album. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. Be sure to hit that subscribe button too. And I'll see you again soon in another video.